The fifth meeting of the 18th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is called to order. Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished observers and friends, I invite the Forum to begin its consideration of Agenda Item 11, Dialogue with Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Chair of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as with the Chair of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers this morning, Ms. Victoria Tauli Korpus, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Erika Yamada, Chair of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as Ms. Claire Charters, Chair of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I first give the floor to the distinguished member of the Forum, Mr. Les Malleser, to make an introductory statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I've prepared this introduction to this agenda item on human rights. We are aware there are three mechanisms in operation that have important roles in the implementation of human rights for Indigenous peoples, but indeed there are four mechanisms, and let me list those bodies for clarity. We have the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. This is indeed an impressive achievement in the organisation of the United Nations. We know that it is important that the work of these mechanisms are complementary and also that the roles and agendas do not overlap or duplicate. Each mechanism has its mandate and method of work. As the Permanent Forum, we must provide the opportunity for delegations from Indigenous peoples to bring their news, their issues, reports and concerns to the United Nations. From their statements and applying our expert knowledge, we look to advise the Economic and Social Council in its work. Included in that process, we also advise the work of subsidiary bodies and organisations operating under the umbrella of ECOSOC. Our core role in this regard is to operate as a forum, a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples. While we are also open to assist states, this forum essentially operates with the purpose to receive the information brought from Indigenous peoples around the world and to process such information for ECOSOC and the associated organisations and agencies. We are not a body to resolve complaints of abuse of human rights. That is more correctly the role of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Special Rapporteur has a wide mandate to hear complaints and to engage parties, especially states, who have obligations under the Charter to promote and respect rights and freedoms of all peoples, a duty which, in our context, includes without discrimination the rights of Indigenous peoples. And this is affirmed in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Permanent Forum again welcomes the Special Rapporteur to our session to provide reports and information about her work and to listen for and to hear from Indigenous peoples and the situation of human rights in their communities. The Special Rapporteur also makes time available during the period of our session to hold private meetings when appropriate with delegations from Indigenous peoples. Madam Chairperson, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council, and in that context is able to receive information from delegates of Indigenous peoples and engage with states on behalf of Indigenous peoples, and this function operates within the scope of the human rights family under the auspices of the Human Rights Council and High Commissioner for Human Rights. The placement of the expert mechanism in this environment provides MREP with a strong process to engage the UN in a human rights framework founded strongly on equality and non-discrimination. The framework includes many special rapporteurs working on thematic issues and on country-based issues, various working groups, the human rights treaty bodies, and the Universal Periodic Review procedure applying now to states. All of these mechanisms I mentioned under the Human Rights Council have capacity within context to defend the rights of Indigenous peoples. The Permanent Forum notes MRIP has recently reviewed its operations to increase its capacity to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially through country visits. We are pleased to welcome MRIP to the Permanent Forum and encourage MRIP to promote its work and to hear and learn in this forum from the delegations of Indigenous peoples. The Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples should not be underestimated in this company. The fund is vital to Indigenous peoples to engage at the level of global governance and hold states to account under the Charter of the United Nations. The Voluntary Fund is central to the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the work of the United Nations in all of its manifestations. The fund has been important for the development of Indigenous peoples to participate as equals without discrimination in global governance. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Permanent Forum itself to see that the Voluntary Fund is prominent during the discussions under this agenda item. To conclude this introductory statement, I turn now to the human rights aspects of this Permanent Forum. Most observers here understand that our work covers 6 areas, one of which is human rights. Our work is able to reach many international organisations through the Economic and Social Council, and subsequently much of our attention is drawn to matters at the global level. I have already mentioned that we were established specifically and purposely to be structured as a permanent forum. We must hold true to that intention. Yesterday, my colleague Gervais Nazoa presented the case for work and methodology of the Permanent Forum to be updated as intended based upon the ECOSOC Resolution 2000/22. In that resolution, it was intended for the modus operandi of the Permanent Forum to be reviewed after 5 years' operation to strengthen the work and outcomes. But indeed, 5 years later, in 2007, all of our attention was drawn to the draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In that year, the Declaration became established through the highest authorities of the newly created Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. For Indigenous peoples of the world, it was the end of a lengthy campaign beginning almost 100 years ago at the League of Nations, and finally following a quarter century of intensive work undertaken around the end of last century within the United Nations and in conjunction with the Indigenous peoples of the world. But to jump to the present time, it is disappointing to realise that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has still not been implemented anywhere in the world in any acceptable form since its adoption. That was 12 years ago. Also, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the outcome document, an action plan unanimously adopted by the states 5 years ago, has failed to summon even the most minor of actions from states. If we return also to the ILO Convention, a treaty, Convention number 169, a treaty established 30 years ago to protect rights of Indigenous peoples, we find the treaty is ratified by only 24 countries and is virtually inert in those countries in protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Yet every year, the resolutions and recommendations of the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and from the UPR process, ILO Convention number 169 remains ignored. Article 42 of the Declaration calls upon the Permanent Forum to promote respect for and, I quote, full application of the provisions of the Declaration and follow up the effectiveness of the Declaration. So we are there to promote the full application. This was a new mandate placed upon the Permanent Forum after its establishment in ECOSOC 5 years ago. 5 years previous. But no changes were made within the Permanent Forum as a result of this new mandate. At its 8th session 10 years ago, in 2009, the Permanent Forum recommended to ECOSOC that the Secretary-General provide adequate human and financial resources for the purpose of meeting the requirements of Articles 41 and 42 of the Declaration as they apply to the Permanent Forum. That recommendation still stands unaddressed. The work of the Permanent Forum under this additional and extremely large mandate established 12 years ago seems to have had little or no impact. The Permanent Forum continues to fail in its role to achieve full application of the provisions of this Declaration. Madam Chairperson, I now conclude the introductory remarks at this point. The The work of the Permanent Forum must be strengthened, and states must find the will to change the long history concerning Indigenous peoples of the world, their rights over lands, territories and resources, and their rights to self-determination in all of its manifestations. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
I thank Mr. Maleser for his statement. And now I give the floor to the Secretary of the Forum, Ms. Sangeeta Sharma.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and a very good morning to everybody. Just wanted to clarify the procedure during the interactive dialogue, which will take place immediately following the presentations by the speakers on the podium. When the chair opens the floor, delegations from member states and the intergovernmental organizations, specialized agencies, etc., who have a nameplate can, of course, press their buttons on the console if they wish to intervene, and your names will show up on the consoles here on the podium. For representatives of Indigenous peoples' organizations, if you would be so kind as to provide the name of your organization to representatives of the Forum Secretariat, who will be seated in the back of the room where I am pointing. That way we will have an indication of the organizations, and the chair will then call upon the organization that she wishes to give the floor to, and you are then kindly requested to press the button on your console so that the sound engineer knows how to identify you and activate your microphone. I thank you very much, Madam Chair.
I thank the Secretary of the Forum, Ms. Sangeeta Sharma. And now I invite the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ms. Victoria Tauli Korpus, to take the floor. You have the floor, Madam.
Madam Chairperson of the Permanent Forum, Madam Chairperson of MRIP, Madam Chairperson of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, Excellencies, Indigenous representatives, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to address the Permanent Forum and all those attending the interactive discussion on the human rights situations of Indigenous peoples. Let me congratulate you, Madam Chair, for being elected to this post and offer my continuing cooperation with the Forum. In my intervention today, I would like to provide an update on my work as a Special Rapporteur since I reported last year, and to elaborate on some of the activities I have been involved in the four interrelated areas of work: the preparation of thematic reports, the conduct of country visits, the response to cases of alleged human rights violations, and the technical assistance and promotion of best practices. Excuse me. Thematic reports. As I mentioned to you in my intervention last year, in September 2018, I submitted to the Human Rights Council a thematic report on the issue of attacks and criminalization against Indigenous peoples and the availability of prevention and protection measures. The report documents a worrying escalation in the criminalization and harassment suffered by Indigenous peoples, in particular when they are defending and exercising their rights to their lands, territories, and natural resources. In this report, I assessed the root causes and drivers of the current situation of criminalization and mapped global trends and provided some examples of particularly worrying situations. I called the situation of criminalization of and impunity against Indigenous peoples as a global crisis. Human rights violations often arise when Indigenous leaders and community members voice their concerns over large-scale extractive, agribusiness, infrastructure, hydroelectric, or logging projects affecting their lands and territories, and undertaken without adequate consultations or their free, prior, and informed consent. I have also considered the criminalization of Indigenous peoples when exercising their rights to self-governance, including the exercise of their justice systems, and some of their economic and cultural practices, such as shifting cultivation and hunting and gathering, among others. as described in this year's report of the Permanent Forum. It is urgent to adopt a zero-tolerance approach to violence and killings of indigenous human rights defenders. Prompt and impartial investigations of attacks must be undertaken. Accountability for those responsible for these human rights violations is crucial. Widespread impunity is a key factor for the perpetuation of this situation and increases exponentially the vulnerability of the victims. Combating criminalization requires a comprehensive review of national laws and revocation of legislation and criminal procedures that violate the principle of legality and contradict international human rights obligations. This should include the review of anti-terrorist and national security laws and legislation, which are used to declare certain economic activities as of public interest, quote-unquote, general interest, or national priority, which justify the violation of indigenous peoples' human rights. Provisions that in practice criminalize the freedom of expression in assembly should be repealed. Criminalization is often preceded by campaigns of stigmatization and vilification of key indigenous leaders, human rights defenders, and even indigenous organizations. These acts are underpinned by racism and discrimination and are generally aimed at indigenous peoples who are defending their rights to their lands, territories, and resources, and their ways of life. I should like to underline the responsibility the media have in this regard. Actors other than states have to also assume the responsibilities to reverse this serious situation. Private companies have a responsibility to exert human rights due diligence in all operations, adopt clear policy commitments to that effect, and perform ongoing human rights impact assessments with the full participation of affected indigenous communities in their operations. They should also carefully consider the human rights implications and responsibilities involved in their claims against states in cases of non-compliance with contracts or licenses due to human rights concerns. On their part, international donors and financial institutions need to adopt safeguards consistent with international human rights standards in all the projects they fund and support, and consistently monitor their effective implementation, notably by requiring human rights impact assessments and demanding specific protection for indigenous peoples and accessible procedures to pursue remedies if needed. Regarding prevention and protection measures for indigenous human rights defenders, I have stressed the need to consider the collective nature of the impacts of violence and criminalization in the case of indigenous peoples. Such measures should be culturally appropriate, gender sensitive, and developed jointly with communities concerned. Support for community-led protection measures should be prioritized. I would like to stress that in my view, the situation of violence and criminalization suffered by indigenous peoples globally requires urgent and concerted efforts by all those involved in the promotion and protection of human rights. On my part, I will continue to give special attention to this issue in my country visits, communications, and engagements with indigenous peoples and state representatives. In my report, to the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, I provided some preliminary comments on the topic of self-governance systems indigenous peoples are implementing all over the world. Indigenous governance systems have proven resilient for centuries, despite colonization and attempts to undermine them in the name of nation-building, cultural and religious homogeneity, or economic growth. These indigenous governance systems are closely linked to the generation, transmission, and protection of traditional knowledge. They remain essential in ensuring the well-being of indigenous peoples and thus are part of the exercise of their right to self-determination and to decide their own paths of development. My report provides an initial overview of the international legal framework on the right to autonomy and self-government of indigenous peoples and reviews some examples of the broad diversity of indigenous governance systems that exist across the world. The report stresses that sustainable development can only be achieved by guaranteeing the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I also submitted a report to the Human Rights Council summarizing the discussions on a meeting held in Lima in coordination with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights regarding indigenous peoples in isolation and initial contact. The particular situation of these indigenous peoples has received the attention of both the United Nations system, including the special rapporteurs and the permanent forum itself, and of the Inter-American Human Rights system. I am glad that we have been able to cooperate in advancing discussions on how to ensure that the fundamental rights of these indigenous peoples are guaranteed, including their right not to be contacted. The conclusions highlight the need to redouble the efforts to improve protection for the territories and natural resources of indigenous peoples in isolation and initial contact in line with international standards. There is also a need to develop and adequately implement differentiated policies directed to indigenous peoples in initial contact, notably in the area of health. I would like to encourage member states and in the international human rights system to pay attention to this question and fully cooperate with governments concerned, indigenous peoples' organizations, and experts to implement the specific human rights standards on the issue, particularly considering recent worrying developments in some Amazonian countries. Ongoing thematic work. I would like now to briefly comment on the thematic issues I am currently working on. My next report to the Human Rights Council will focus on indigenous justice systems. Indigenous people's own systems of justice is a subject which has recurrently been addressed by the mandate holders, including through country visits, communications, and in seminars and conferences. The maintenance of indigenous people's own customary legal institutions and norms is an essential aspect of their right to self-determination. Although indigenous jurisdictional functions have been recognized in legislation and practice at the national level in several countries, operation of indigenous jurisdiction is still contested and legal pluralism is still not a reality. In-depth intercultural dialogue and understanding between state and indigenous authorities is vital, taking into account indigenous good practices and building on existing positive results. The main concerns raised by indigenous peoples in this regard are the lack of effective recognition of and support for their systems of justice by state authorities, ongoing discriminatory and prejudicial attitudes against their justice systems, and the lack of effective methods of coordination and cooperation between their justice systems and the state ordinary justice authorities. Linked to this topic is the question of obstacles faced by indigenous peoples when trying to access the ordinary justice system, which include, among others, the lack of interpretation for those who only speak their mother tongue during hearings. Lack of access to justice is directly connected to the impunity in cases of violence and criminalization, which I mentioned earlier. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples contains clear and relevant provisions on these two aspects of indigenous peoples and justice. Articles 5 and 34 assert the right of indigenous peoples to maintain and strengthen their political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, and to promote and develop their institutional structures, including their juridical systems or customs in accordance with international human rights standards. The Declaration furthermore affirms the right of indigenous peoples to access and to prompt decisions through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes with states or other parties, as well as to effective remedies for all infringements of their individual and collective rights, which should give due consideration to the customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems of the indigenous peoples concerned and international human rights. As you may be aware, I have requested views and contributions on this issue from member states, indigenous peoples, and other actors. I entreat you all to provide me with useful information that can contribute to the elaboration of this report. Finally, I will submit next October my last report to the General Assembly. I intend to provide further views on indigenous self-governance and autonomy and comment on the main topics that have recurrently appeared in the course of my work for the mandate. For the preparation of this report, I had the honor to co-organize an international seminar of the right to self-determination, together with the Permanent Forum, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The seminar was coordinated by the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs and supported by the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples of Mexico, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Teba Foundation, all of whom I would like to thank. The seminar provided valuable reflections on the advances and challenges in the consolidation of indigenous self-determination and autonomy in many regions of the world. I would like to take into account the rich inputs that took place during the meeting in the elaboration of my report. Madam Chair, just after the 2018 session of the UN Permanent Forum, I conducted a country visit to Guatemala. During my mission, I observed that indigenous peoples in the country, despite constituting the majority of the population, continue to face structural racism and discrimination, reflected in their lack of access to justice, to political participation, and to the enjoyment of their economic, social, and cultural rights. The country report examines the root cause of this situation, including impunity, corruption, institutional weakness, and the legacy of violence from the long internal armed conflict. The failure to adequately implement the peace accords, particularly the 1995 Accord on Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Identity, has undermined progress in many areas. I noted as a particular concern the lack of protection for the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and natural resources, and I expressed my deep concern over the violence, attacks, forced evictions, and criminalization faced by indigenous peoples who defend their rights, particularly in the context of infrastructure and extractive industries development. I submitted my report on Guatemala visit to the 39th session of the Human Rights Council in September 2018. Since then, I have been following up with concern the situation regarding the rights of indigenous peoples in the country, which I have addressed through a number of communications and public press releases. My visit to Ecuador in November last year took place in the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the 2008 Monte Cristo Constitution. Therefore, I thought it would be timely to assess the progress in the implementation of the constitutional commitments regarding the building of a plurinational and intercultural state and the effective implementation of the collective rights of indigenous communes, communities, peoples, and nationalities in the light of Ecuador's international human rights obligations in this regard. I also wanted to follow up the outstanding observations and recommendations made by my predecessors, Rodolfo Stavenhagen in 2006 and James Anaya in 2009. In the end of my mission statement, I highlighted the dialogue that the new government has initiated with indigenous peoples and its encouraging results, particularly with regard to intercultural bilingual education and the commitments expressed by Ecuador with the indigenous people's rights at the international level. My statement also reflected the main concerns expressed by indigenous peoples during my mission regarding the current situation. there has been little progress in adopting concrete measures to address the key issues affecting their fundamental rights, particularly with regards to their lands and resources, the respect for their own authorities, including indigenous justice systems, or the implementation of consultation and free prior informed consent. I stress my concern about measures announced by the government regarding the activation of former mining and oil concessions, as well as the granting of new concessions, taking into account these extractive industries where activities were undertaken without adequate consultation or consent were denounced by indigenous peoples as the main source of gross violations of their human rights. The mission report will also be presented to the 42nd session of the Human Rights Council next September, assesses the specific situation of indigenous peoples with small populations, indigenous peoples near the northern border, indigenous peoples in isolation and initial contact, and indigenous women. I hope to maintain an open and fruitful dialogue with the government of Ecuador for the implementation of the recommendations contained herein. As I commented last year, I have been making special efforts to seek invitations to conduct country visits in the regions of Africa and Asia, and I will continue to do so for the rest of my mandate. I would like to respectfully request member states in these regions to engage in a dialogue with the mandate and consider the possibility of extending me official invitations. I am grateful to the government of Timor-Leste for its invitation, which has allowed me to conduct my first official mission in an Asian country from April 7 to 16, 2019. My end of mission statement addresses a range of issues, including customary and formal justice systems, lands and territories, conservation, climate change, education, poverty, and malnutrition. I am impressed by the pride that Timorese take in their cultural heritage and how indigenous practices have translated into important gains in environmental protection and biodiversity conservation. This can serve as inspiring examples for other countries. For most Timorese, customary practices are an integral part of everyday life and play a central role in resolving disputes between individuals and communities, such as land disputes, conflict between communities, and natural resources management. These practices focus on maintaining community and environmental harmony, in contrast to the formal justice system, which is perpetrator-focused. Ensuring justice for all is a key objective of Sustainable Development Goal 16, and Timor-Leste could provide important lessons for other countries. There are, however, customary justice practices that need to be amended to comply with human rights standards, such as physical punishments and public communal hearings, which are clearly unsuitable for crimes relating to vulnerable victims of domestic violence and child abuse. I wish to recall that the UN Declaration affirms the right to maintain and strengthen indigenous legal institutions and juridical systems or customs, with the caveat that this should be in accordance with international human rights standards. Customary justice practices by indigenous peoples are not static, and in my experience, indigenous communities are generally open to incorporating human rights guarantees in their practices. This change needs to come from within indigenous communities, but can be encouraged by increased awareness raising of international and national legal standards through culturally appropriate dialogues. In this regard, I wish to note that such dialogue needs to aim at mutual exchange of how both systems can address these shortcomings and increase knowledge of procedures and best practices in the respective system. Another concern raised during my visit is that East Timor-Leste continues to confront the highest rate of chronic malnutrition in Southeast Asia and among the highest in the world. Statistics indicate that nearly half of all children under 5 years of age suffer from chronic malnutrition. I urge the government to assign adequate resources to the Strategic Development Plan 2011 to 2030 and the 2070 SDG roadmap to increase production of indigenous crops to address the incidence of malnutrition. Education is intrinsically linked to achieving developments related to poverty reduction and health. In this regard, I call on government to take further measures to revitalize and promote the more than 30 languages in Timor-Leste and expand education in mother tongue in order to improve educational reforms. The full report from my mission will be presented to the Human Rights Council in September 2019. Promotion of good practices and technical assistance. All throughout 2018 to the present, I have produced several technical comments at the request of government institutions or indigenous peoples, particularly on the issue of rights to consultation and free, prior, and informed consent, and indigenous peoples' access to justice. I have also conducted several academic visits at the invitation of national human rights institutions, academic institutions, indigenous and civil society organizations, and governmental bodies, including to Australia, Canada, Colombia, Mexico, Norway, and Malaysia. These visits have allowed me to better engage in dialogue on particular issues affecting the rights of indigenous peoples and exchange information on best practices to advance the implementation of the rights enshrined in the Declaration and other relevant human rights instruments. I want to thank all those that have made this fruitful visit possible and the OHCHR country offices for their support to make the best of them. Communications. I continued examining cases of alleged violations of the human rights of indigenous peoples and addressed the concerned countries and other actors through communications procedures, either independently or jointly with other special procedures. Cases addressed are included in the Special Procedures Joint Communications Report, which is submitted to each session of the Human Rights Council. In 2018, the mandate issued 55 communications to more than 20 different countries, as well as to other entities, such as private corporations and intergovernmental organizations. I also issued several public releases on a range of different topics, including the degrading treatment of indigenous Papuans by the Indonesian police in Army and West Papua, the collapse of a tailings dam in Minas Gerais, Brazil, the amendments to the Guatemala National Reconciliation Law, indigenous migrant children in detention in the United States of America, the adoption of the Escazú Agreement, a court ruling recognizing the Ixil Mayans as victims of genocide in Guatemala, the conviction of 7 persons involved in the murder of Berta Cáceres in Honduras, and the local indigenous communities and indigenous peoples platform in the implementation of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and specific cases on killings, violence, and criminalization of indigenous individuals and communities. Some of the communications and press releases have had immediate impact. In January 2018, together with other special procedures, I issued a press release to draw attention to violations against the Sengwer in relation to a major climate change project in the Imbobot forest in Kenya. Within 48 hours, the European Commission, which was funding the project, decided to suspend the project pending a human rights impact assessment. I will continue monitoring the situation of the Sengwer. In my recent visit to Mexico, I was visited by 2 ex-detainees who are indigenous leaders who expressed their thanks to my communications, which resulted into the release from detention. Madam Chair, I would like to conclude recalling the International Year of Indigenous Languages we are celebrating. Last January, I had the honor to participate in the launching of this celebration, invited by UNESCO. On the occasion, I remarked on the importance of our indigenous mother tongues, which reflect the wonderful variety and richness of our cultures, indigenous and heritage. Indigenous languages are part of indigenous knowledge, our precious collective heritage. Allow me to stress that the only way to ensure that they are protected and transmitted is by ensuring the survival and well-being of indigenous peoples who created them and use them every day. This will only be achieved through the full implementation of indigenous people's human rights. I thank you all for your kind attention, and I look forward to a rich discussion on these topics during our interactive dialogue. Thank you.
I thank the Special Rapporteur of her statement. And now I give the floor to the chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, Ms. Erika Yamada. You have the floor, madam.
Gracias. Señora Presidenta, Excelencias, miembros del Foro Permanente, señora Relatora Especial sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, señora Presidenta del Fondo Voluntario para los Pueblos Indígenas, representantes de los pueblos indígenas, distinguidos delegados, señoras y señores, buenos días y muchas gracias por esa oportunidad. Quisiera también empezar celebrando el Año Internacional de las Lenguas Indígenas como un marco para Naciones Unidas. Señora Presidenta, en nombre de mis colegas del Mecanismo de Expertos de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, quisiera felicitarla por su nombramiento como presidenta de este foro. También aprovecho la oportunidad para reconocer la contribución dedicada de mis colegas, miembros del mecanismo, en un año de mucho trabajo que hemos tenido en la defensa de los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas. Agradecemos a todos los miembros y al personal de la Secretaría del Foro Permanente por la excelente organización de este periodo de sesiones, así como a todos los representantes indígenas presentes hoy, muchos de los cuales han viajado largas distancias, muchas veces con la aprehensión de dejar sus pueblos y sus comunidades en contextos nacionales de ataques, pero también de mucha resistencia y lucha para participar de este periodo de sesiones. Naciones Unidas se llena de vida, conciencia y muchos sentimientos cuando ustedes están acá. La declaración y su urgente aplicación se hacen concretas desde la mirada de todos cuando están con ustedes. Antes de continuar, permítame presentar brevemente el mecanismo de expertos sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. El mecanismo es un órgano subsidiario del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas. Fue establecido en el año 2007 con el mandato de proporcionar al Consejo la experiencia y el asesoramiento sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, según lo establecido en la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Somos actualmente 7 miembros y trabajamos para ayudar a los Estados miembros a lograr los fines de la Declaración mediante la promoción, protección y cumplimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Señora Presidenta, el mecanismo de expertos celebró su 11º periodo de sesiones en julio de 2018. Entre los participantes había más de 50 estados miembros y aproximadamente 200 organizaciones de pueblos indígenas y organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Participaron también instituciones académicas y de derechos humanos e instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos. Durante la 11ª sesión, finalizamos y adoptamos los 2 informes. Un estudio intitulado El consentimiento libre, previo e informado, con enfoque baseado en los derechos humanos, y el informe anual del mecanismo al Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Nuestro estudio destaca la base de derechos humanos para el consentimiento libre, previo e informado, en gran parte basado en el derecho a la libre determinación y en el derecho a la no discriminación. La ausencia de un enfoque basado en los derechos humanos ya ha llevado a muchos malentendidos de qué es el consentimiento libre, previo e informado. Malentendidos que resumen el consentimiento a la mera consulta, a la legitimación de posiciones de gobiernos o de empresas y a veces al silenciamiento de los pueblos indígenas. El consentimiento libre, previo e informado bajo la Declaración de Naciones Unidas trata de que los pueblos indígenas puedan realmente influir en el resultado del proceso de toma de decisiones de los estados. No es solo un derecho a participar o a ser escuchado en los procesos que los afectan, sino de influenciar. Según lo declarado por el Alto Comisionado de los Derechos Humanos, el consentimiento libre, previo e informado es una manifestación del derecho a la libre determinación, que ha sido llamado el corazón y el alma de la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Así que el mecanismo ecoa las preocupaciones de los diversos órganos de tratados de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, de los procedimientos especiales y de la Oficina del Alto de Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos sobre la importancia de la interpretación de qué es el consentimiento libre previo informado, que no puede ser un mero proceso consultivo, ya que esa insuficiente consideración ha sido causa de graves violaciones a los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas en todo el mundo. Esperamos que este informe sirva como contribución del mecanismo para la comprensión, el debate y la adopción de nuevas leyes y políticas nacionales sobre este tema, incluso para fortalecer iniciativas como la de los protocolos autónomos de consulta y consentimientos que desarrollan pueblos indígenas en algunos países del mundo. El estudio considera el avance de la jurisprudencia internacional de derechos humanos sobre el consentimiento libre previo informado. El estudio establece el significado de la palabra consentimiento y ofrece una revisión crítica de estas prácticas, alentando a todos los actores a adoptar una interpretación sustantiva de derechos humanos para la aplicación del consentimiento libre previo informado. El estudio concluye con algunas medidas que los estados, los pueblos indígenas y otras partes interesadas pueden tomar para implementar el consentimiento libre previo informado. Esperamos que todos aprovechen este estudio y consideren como herramientas prácticas para desarrollar a partir de la garantía de este derecho en el terreno. También esperamos que un enfoque concertado sobre qué es el consentimiento libre previo informado entre los mecanismos de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas que trabajan a nivel de base pueda llevar un mayor respeto a esa norma esencial de derechos humanos en la vida cotidiana de los pueblos indígenas en todo el mundo. Señora Presidenta, uno de los elementos más emocionantes de nuestro nuevo mandato es el alcance del compromiso a nivel de país para apoyar los pueblos indígenas y los estados en la implementación de la declaración. En 2018 iniciamos una línea de trabajo prometedora para el mecanismo, ya que emprendimos misiones a países para brindar con cooperación técnica y asesoramiento legal para la implementación de derechos específicos de la declaración en países como Finlandia y México. A principios de este mes completamos nuestra tercera misión, que se centró en brindar asesoramiento técnico a los maoris y al gobierno de Nueva Zelanda en relación a un plan de acción nacional para la implementación de la declaración. El mecanismo presentará una nota de asesoramiento a las partes sobre ese plan de acción a su debido tiempo. Hemos recibido más de 10 solicitudes de ese tipo de asesoramiento técnico que cubre la mayoría de las regiones socioculturales indígenas. Las solicitudes varían desde la asistencia de la redacción de una legislación hasta el desarrollo de capacidades de instituciones de gobierno, desde el desarrollo de planes de acción nacionales hasta la repatriación de restos humanos y objetos sagrados de los pueblos indígenas. También incluye la posibilidad de definir indicadores para la implementación de recomendaciones del examen periódico universal sobre la situación de derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas en los países. Si bien los estados también pueden solicitar la asistencia del mecanismo de experto, hasta la fecha, la mayoría de las solicitudes provienen de pueblos indígenas. Aprovecho entonces esta oportunidad para alentar a otros pueblos y estados a que soliciten el apoyo del mecanismo para trabajar al nivel nacional con ese tipo de asesoramiento. Señora Presidenta, permítame ahora pasar a la próxima sesión del mecanismo que tendrá lugar en Ginebra del 15 al 19 de julio de 2019. La agenda incluirá una mesa redonda sobre las mujeres indígenas en el poder, Indigenous Women in Power, donde las mujeres indígenas actualmente o que fueran recién representantes en parlamentos nacionales van a compartir con nosotros sus experiencias, sus motivaciones personales y colectivas y los desafíos que han enfrentado para estar en estos puestos importantes nacionales en la política general. La 12ª sesión también incluirá un diálogo entre los pueblos indígenas y los 4 mecanismos aquí. Mantendremos una discusión sobre el trabajo de asesoramiento en los países, donde vamos a compartir nuestras experiencias recientes en el campo y también abordaremos algunas de las solicitudes prometedoras que ya hemos recibido. Señora Presidenta, en nuestro próximo periodo de sesiones vamos a discutir un borrador de un estudio temático sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en contexto de las fronteras, la migración y el desplazamiento. En noviembre de 2018, con el apoyo de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Chiang Mai, en Tailandia, organizamos un seminario de expertos sobre este tema que reunió más de 30 expertos y profesionales, incluidos expertos indígenas, que proporcionaron al mecanismo de expertos contribuciones muy valuadas para este borrador. El estudio será presentado y adoptado durante nuestra próxima sesión en julio en Ginebra y pretende ser un paso adelante en la comprensión de los problemas y necesidades de los pueblos indígenas en el contexto de la migración en relación con los derechos de la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Esta área es una área de investigación muy limitada hasta la fecha y que necesita de más estrechamiento incluso para la implementación del Pacto Global de Migraciones que tiene que tener una mirada también sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. En este informe exploramos las causas, las consecuencias y experiencias de los pueblos indígenas en movimiento desde su perspectiva y buscamos asesorar a los estados sobre cómo garantizar la protección de sus derechos, como pueblos indígenas, como migrantes y de sus derechos humanos. Durante nuestro próximo periodo de sesiones también presentaremos un informe sobre buenas prácticas y desafíos en la implementación de la declaración, centrado en un tema crucial que es el tema del reconocimiento, la reparación y la reconciliación de los estados con los pueblos indígenas. Para terminar, señora Presidenta, quisiera agradecer al Foro Permanente por su contribución continua con el mecanismo de expertos y en nombre de mis colegas expertos expresar nuestro compromiso y colaboración continua. Entendemos que la tarea de aprimorar cada vez más nuestro trabajo para que los mecanismos respondan efectivamente a la demanda de los pueblos indígenas y de los gobiernos es una tarea continua, urgente y colectiva. Muchas gracias.
I thank the chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples for her statement. And now I invite the chair of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Claire Charters, to make a statement. You have the floor, madam.
Ena mana, ena iwi, ena reo, tēnā koutou katoa. Chair, members of the UN Permanent Forum, representatives of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN Special Rapporteur, representatives of Indigenous peoples, civil society and international organisations, Your Excellencies, and a particular mihi to ministers present today, thank you for the opportunity to address the session of the Permanent Forum on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Congratulations to the Chair on her appointment to this position. I represent here also my colleagues on the board, Ms. Miana Cunningham from Nicaragua, Mr. Binyota Damai, Bangladesh, Mr. Moshia Diel, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ms. Anya Nwegam from Finland. We are committed, enthusiastic and unwavering in our efforts to continue the work of the Fund. The board especially welcomes the 60 beneficiaries of the Fund who are present with us today in unprecedented numbers. You join over more than 2,300 beneficiaries from over 90 countries who have participated in UN fora since 1985, supported by the Fund. We also would like to especially congratulate Member States who contribute to the Fund, and in 2018 in record numbers. Thank you to Argentina, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Finland, the Holy See, Mexico, Norway, and Spain. We are deeply grateful and appreciative. With a mandate that has been expanded 7 times, grantees of the Fund have contributed to groundbreaking advances achieved at the international level for Indigenous peoples, enhancing the protection of human rights and dignity, including in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in international human rights jurisprudence by the Commission on Human Rights, international UN human rights treaty bodies, the UN Council, and the UN Special Rapporteurs on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014, and by enabling Indigenous peoples to build partnerships and exchange information with other Indigenous peoples and to work together with governments, UN agencies, NGOs and experts. Given financial constraints facing many Indigenous peoples, it is questionable whether these advances would have been possible without the support of the Voluntary Fund. The international community should be proud of these changes. It reflects a maturity and global commitment to the well-being of humankind and all its peoples. It also enhances the legitimacy of the international system. The Fund currently supports the participation of representatives of Indigenous peoples in the sessions of the Permanent Forum and the Expert Mechanism before UN Human Rights Treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council, including especially the Universal Periodic Review. The Fund also supports Indigenous participation in General Assembly-based efforts to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation as Indigenous peoples in the UN, including in the interactive dialogue occurring tomorrow. As a result of these expansions in the Fund's scope, Indigenous peoples' human rights concerns are channelled into the bodies that can address them, enhancing the efficacy of the work of Indigenous peoples and the work of the UN. Chair, Excellencies, friends, I will now update on the recent activities of the Board. The Fund received 675 applications for the 2019 sessions of the Permanent Forum and Expert Mechanism alone. The Board of Trustees allocated grants as follows: 45 grants for Indigenous representatives at the session of the Permanent Forum, 14 for Indigenous representatives to attend the interactive hearings on Indigenous people's participation at the UN, and 45 grants for Indigenous representatives to attend the next session of the Expert Mechanism. The Fund also has 40 grants available throughout this year for Indigenous peoples to attend the Human Rights Council, including the Universal Periodic Review processes and the Human Rights Treaty Body sessions. Put another way, the Fund has tripled the number of grantees over the last 6 years, with a significant increase, particularly from last year to this year. The Board has implemented some new initiatives in 2019, including a Senior Indigenous Fellowship, which enables the Fund to enhance its capacity building, outreach and dissemination strategies, and improve support to the beneficiaries attending the Human Rights Treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council. The Fund regularly provides capacity building training to representatives of Indigenous peoples to increase the effectiveness of their participation. For example, in New York, the Fund is now a partner to Tribal Links Project Access Global Capacity Building Training Program workshops. In Geneva, grantees attending the Expert Mechanism are invited to participate in the UNITA or UN Institute for Training and Research annual program to enhance the conflict prevention and peacemaking capacities of Indigenous peoples' representatives. Finally, the Fund is developing better and more comprehensive capacity building materials for Indigenous peoples who benefit from the Fund, including e-tools and web-based materials and improved training. The attendance and contribution of the beneficiaries of the Fund are closely monitored. The feedback is invaluable for improving grantees' experience and for the Fund as a whole. The Board participates in and liaises closely with the Permanent Forum, the UN Special Rapporteur, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially in coordination meetings held at sessions of both bodies. This provides an important opportunity for the Board to support the needs of grantees within the substantive mandates of these bodies. Moreover, the Special Rapporteur, Chair of the Permanent Forum, and members of the Expert Mechanism regularly meet specifically and especially with Fund grantees. The Board seeks always to strengthen its partnerships with states and increasingly counts states and their delegates as friends in our mutual interest in ensuring Indigenous peoples can participate effectively in the UN. The Board meets regularly both multilaterally and bilaterally with states. Looking forward, in response to feedback from Indigenous peoples' organisations and states, the Board of Trustees is scoping the possibility of a further mandate extension to enable it to support grantees who have effective and positive initiatives to follow up their participation in international UN fora, to enable greater Indigenous peoples' participation in the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, to support meetings of the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples during her country visits, and to enable Indigenous participation in the important pre-sessional working group associated with the Universal Periodic Review process. We look forward to discussing these issues with you bilaterally and multilaterally during this session and over the coming year. Chair, Excellencies, friends, as you know, the Fund is exclusively supported by means of voluntary contributions. That is, the Fund would not be in a position to carry out its duties without financial support. To respond to increasing demands and to operate and fulfil its mandate in a satisfactory manner, it is imperative that the Fund receives sustained and increased support from governments and other donors. I would like to appeal to all governments to continue or to consider supporting the vital work of the Voluntary Fund. Thank you.
I thank the Chair of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her statement. And now I will open the floor for interactive dialogue. Participants are reminded to limit their interventions for 3 minutes. Please signify your desire to speak by pressing the button at the base of your microphones. And that's the case for the member states and the UN agencies. And for Indigenous Peoples Organization, there is our staff back of the room, and they are now raising their hands, waving, and give your names in the paper and the organization you represent to our personnel, and they will bring the names here so we can add you to the list of the interventions. And now, first I give the floor. Speakers' microphones will be automatically shut off after 3 minutes have elapsed. And now, first I give the floor to the representative of Spain. You have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta. España está firmemente comprometida con el cumplimiento de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y con la defensa de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en general. De esta manera, España apoya la labor de la relatora especial y del Mecanismo Especial para los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, además de participar activamente tanto en el Grupo de Amigos de los Pueblos Indígenas como en las sesiones del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas y contribuir al Fondo de Contribuciones Voluntarias para los Pueblos Indígenas. Por otro lado, y como miembro del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, España no cesa en su afán de seguir prestando especial atención a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Así, por ejemplo, en la pasada sesión del Consejo, España apoyó la resolución titulada «El reconocimiento de la contribución que hacen los defensores de los derechos humanos relacionados con el medio ambiente al disfrute de los derechos humanos, la protección del medio ambiente y el desarrollo sostenible», en la que se destaca el papel de las personas defensoras de derechos humanos pertenecientes a pueblos indígenas y la necesidad de seguir trabajando en la reducción de las desigualdades y en una verdadera participación de los pueblos indígenas en los procesos de toma de decisiones. En este sentido, quisiera subrayar la importancia que España otorga al trabajo de las personas defensoras, así como nuestra preocupación por la creciente violencia a la que se enfrentan. Una sociedad civil rica constituye un elemento esencial de una democracia que funcione. Por ello, España coincide con la relatora en la necesidad de promover el establecimiento de mecanismos de protección y de prevención que permitan que las personas defensoras puedan desarrollar sus funciones en condiciones de seguridad. Para ello, es prioritario poner en marcha políticas públicas acordes con los estándares internacionales y adoptar medidas encaminadas a la efectiva disminución de los ataques y a la investigación independiente y eficaz de los mismos. España ha venido trabajando desde esta perspectiva a través de distintos mecanismos como el llamado Programa Indígena. En este marco se han realizado actividades para la protección de los defensores y prueba de ello es nuestra intervención en la aplicación de los acuerdos de paz en Colombia a través del fortalecimiento de las organizaciones indígenas o el apoyo a instituciones como la Fiscalía Especial de Etnias y Patrimonio Cultural en Honduras. Asimismo, se están realizando actividades para promover la celebración de procesos de consulta previa, libre e informada. Y quisiera subrayar también el compromiso que España, en estrecha colaboración con la Unión Europea, asume en el acompañamiento y seguimiento de estos casos. Para finalizar, me gustaría preguntar a la relatora su opinión sobre el trabajo de los mecanismos de protección nacionales, así como las medidas necesarias para avanzar en su eficacia, en especial en la prevención de los ataques contra los defensores de los pueblos indígenas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Spain, and I now give the floor to New Zealand, Her Excellency Ms. Nanaia Mahuta, Minister for Maori Development and Minister for Local Government.
Tēnā no tātou e hui hui mai nei. New Zealand welcomes the opportunity in this session to reflect on the distinct but complementary roles of each of the three mechanisms. 2 weeks ago, I was meeting with MRIP members in New Zealand, and this week I'm pleased to be engaging in this forum. In New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi, in combination with other legal and constitutional frameworks, are the foundations upon which standards for Māori engagement and participation are based. In 2017, we established the Māori Crown Relations Portfolio. The creation of that portfolio signals our government's commitment to a healthy relationship. The designation of this role will also provide greater oversight for the whole of government engagement with iwi Māori. As New Zealand approaches the 10-year mark since moving to support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we're also turning our minds towards how we mark this in terms of New Zealand's progress on the Declaration. New Zealand is committed to upholding the rights affirmed by the Declaration and to engaging further with the aspirations it sets forth in accordance with New Zealand's domestic and legal constitutional framework, including the Treaty of Waitangi. This month, I announced that the government will work with Māori to develop a plan of action to drive and measure Aotearoa New Zealand's progress towards the aspirations of the Declaration. The Declaration Plan reinforces our commitment to embed partnership with Māori within the work of government. Developing a Declaration Plan is a significant step towards building and strengthening relationships between Crown and Māori. The Declaration Plan will identify specific actions that can make real progress on the aspirations of Māori as the Indigenous peoples of our country. We welcome the constructive visit by MRIP earlier this month. I acknowledge the Aotearoa Independent Monitoring Mechanism and the New Zealand Human Rights Commission for inviting MRIP to provide advice on how we are to develop a declaration plan. During their time in New Zealand this month, MRIP heard our aspirations about the country we want to be, the aspirations held by both the government and iwi Māori for a future of cooperative relations. Each of these mechanisms will support our journey to develop and implement a declaration plan. MRIP's advice will contribute to the work taking place between Māori and the government to develop proposals. We're looking to formulate a roadmap that enables our government to signpost our domestic obligations, give effect to treaty settlement obligations that embody the self-determining aspirations of iwi Māori. My time at this forum is about sharing our experience and learning also. Nō reira, tēnā.
I thank the representative of New Zealand for her statement. And I'd like to clarify something about this interactive dialogue. This is not a general discussion, and we don't encourage you to read statements, but we would like you to have comments and questions to the speakers of the panelists. And we will have the general discussion afterwards, after the panel. So please give comments and questions to the panelists. And now I have next one on the speaker, my colleague Lourdes Tipanguala. The floor is yours, madam.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Quiero empezar agradeciendo el informe que acaba de presentar la señora relatora especial, doña Victoria. Muchísimas gracias por haber visitado el Ecuador. Sabemos de la importancia de su informe, pero también valoramos muchísimo el momento coyuntural en el que usted llegó. Hay antes y un después del gobierno del correísmo, en donde todos los derechos de los pueblos indígenas fueron conculcados, fueron terminados, fueron eliminados como un derecho colectivo que lo logramos en base a las marchas, a las movilizaciones y por derecho propio. Ahora a su llegada encontró un sistema de educación en cero. El nuevo gobierno está tratando de rehabilitar el sistema de educación bilingüe y aspiramos que las Naciones Unidas en este proyecto, en esta propuesta de declarar el diseño de las lenguas indígenas, conocimientos tradicionales, también se ponga como punto focal ahí la educación intercultural para los pueblos indígenas. Valoro mucho, señora relatora, el informe que usted nos dejó sobre la justicia indígena. Qué importante ha sido que usted en territorio nos dé el oído tanto a los pueblos indígenas como a las nacionalidades y a las organizaciones, porque usted pudo palpar in situ, en territorio, lo que es el tema de la cultura, el tema de las lenguas, el tema de la justicia indígena, la territorialidad, la consulta previa y el derecho que los pueblos indígenas luchamos sobre los territorios en su integridad. Por ello, señora presidenta, señora relatora, quiero decirles que a cualquier otro país que usted visite, hágalo como hizo en Ecuador, tomando como base la intervención directa de los pueblos indígenas. El día miércoles pasado, el movimiento indígena de Cotopaxi tuvo que hacer referencia a su informe en un caso de justicia indígena en Cotopaxi, en un caso de Lourdes Rebeca Pilapaxi, que por haber juzgado en derecho propio, por haber sacado una resolución sobre el derecho territorial, estaba ya un mes en la cárcel como autoridad indígena. Lo hago esta denuncia en la medida que este caso no puede volver a ocurrir en ninguna parte del mundo porque la justicia indígena está reconocido tanto por la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas como por nuestras constituciones. Y el Estado alguna responsabilidad debe tener cuando los operadores de justicia indígena y los operadores de justicia ordinaria no están respetando los acuerdos y las sentencias comunales. Muchísimas gracias, señora relatora, por ese gran aporte al Ecuador y a la región, y espero que su visita no haya sido ni la primera ni la última y vuelva a la región y hagamos una evaluación de aquí a pocos años de ver si el Estado ecuatoriano implementó o no, sobre todo el caso de la justicia indígena desde la justicia ordinaria. Gracias, señora relatora, por su aporte a los pueblos indígenas.
I thank my colleague for her statement, and I now give the floor to to Semija Varnguja. Semija Varnguja. Varnguja.
Thank you for an opportunity to speak on behalf of the Semija Varnguja. I am Frida Hewson of the Unist'ot'en Wet'suwet'en people of Canada. I am here today to express concerns for human rights violations happening to my people. Since time immemorial, my people have lived in balanced relationship with our lands. We depend on the lands to survive, and we're responsible for protecting it. Since Canada began settling on our territories, we have been forced onto reservations and away from our traditional land base. There are fewer and fewer animals to hunt. The salmon run is diminishing, and the water in the river is low. In order to protect what we have left, my family has been reoccupying one of the territories at Tauli, which is along the Morris River in northern British Columbia. My ancestors have lived there since time immemorial, and I have been living there permanently for the last 10 years. In these 10 years, we have constructed a cabin, a healing center for the members of our community who are healing from colonial trauma and addiction, a traditional pit house, and a permaculture garden. We reoccupied our lands to prevent industry from invading and polluting them from pipeline projects. We have practiced free, prior, informed consent to determine who is given access to our territory. We make decisions about our lands through our systems of hereditary leadership and participation in our feast hall. Our hereditary chiefs had said no to the pipelines on the Wet'suwet'en territory. This year, a pipeline company forced a court injunction on us, and if we stop them from entering our territory because they don't have consent, we face arrests. We have not been able to hunt or gather our traditional foods. The company has security and police force for keeping us from exercising our Indigenous rights. Elders, women, and healing center clients have been threatened with arrest for accessing our own territory. The pipeline company is violating Wet'suwet'en law, trespassing on our territory and starting to destroy the land. They have already destroyed the heritage site. After bulldozing part of the forest, we searched through the piles of dirt for evidence of my people. We found artifacts. The archaeology branch of the government and police assistants came in and took the artifacts and then released news bulletins claiming the artifacts were not from their original place. They are trying to erase us from our own land. All these acts that continue are the acts of genocide. They want to extinguish our rights to our lands. My people depend on our territory for berries, medicine, meat, healing on the land. I am here today to make the UN aware of the territory or continuous genocide happening in Canada and to demand that our Indigenous rights and laws are respected. We extend an invitation to
I thank the representative of Semilla Barranqua, and I guess the last sentence of the speaker, Freda Hewson, was that they are going to extend the invitation to the special rapporteur. And now it's my pleasure to give the possibility for Vicky to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make this more interactive, and I'd like to respond to what the Ambassador of Spain said, as well as to Lourdes Tiban's comment. In relation to the question about how can the protection mechanisms of Spain can be even made more effective. First of all, I'd like to thank you. I know I'm aware about the protection mechanisms that you have done. I know of a person who has been able to benefit from this, and I think this is a very good practice on the side of governments to provide for sanctuaries for indigenous leaders who are persecuted in their own countries, and to bring them to Spain for a few months to be safe, to be kept safe, no? And I think this is something that I'm asking many governments to do as well, because indigenous peoples who are persecuted and who are being subjected to threats should really be able to find possibilities to get out of their countries if they cannot find sanctuary within the country that they are living in. So I'd like you to increase further the support for this effort. And of course, I'd like to also ask you to increase efforts for prevention. We really would like to prevent these kinds of criminalization efforts and impunity. So if you can do more work with the government to talk about how these kinds of efforts can be prevented, that will also be very significant for most of the people who are subjected to threats and harassments. With regards to Lourdes, she's not here now, but I just wanted to mention that, yes, I did look at the indigenous justice systems in Ecuador. In fact, I had meetings with indigenous justice authorities. I went to visit 3 justice authorities who were imprisoned because they made judgments on some issues that have happened in their communities, and they were still put in prison. And I had a meeting with the Supreme Court justices and the Constitutional Court justices. And one of the Supreme Court justices was very impressive because he told us that actually a lot of the decisions, a lot of the justice issues are really resolved at the level of indigenous justice systems. And the courts of Ecuador should really talk more about how they can interface and coordinate with the indigenous justice system. So I think this is an ongoing recommendation that I would like to make, that the state authorities, especially those involved in the justice system, should really have dialogues with indigenous justice authorities to explore how they can coordinate and interface, because the reality in most countries is that and this is confirmed by the international juries. I had a meeting with the international juries, and they have a report on traditional justice saying that 90% of the justice issues in the world are actually resolved through customary systems, not through the formal justice system. So that tells us that there is really an urgent need to talk about this in a more systematic way, so that the justice systems of indigenous peoples will really be able to function in the best ways possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicky. And now next we'll have, I will allow maybe 6 questions, comments before giving possibility for the panelists to answer. So next one on my list is Canada. The representative of Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning to all delegations. I'm speaking on behalf of several nations and organizations. Nigan Ksemanto na Naskamau. Anohtso ma ei namago ka seminokta kiska maikan mohteun sigasun. I began my intervention in my language, the language of my ancestors. My statement during this discussion, Madam Chair, is actually about the transmission and protection of indigenous peoples' knowledge systems through language. But first, I want to, on behalf of all of those that I represent, thank our Special Rapporteur, Vicky Tauli Korpus, as she comes to an end of her term, for her outstanding contribution not only to indigenous peoples but to humankind. Also, I would ask maybe my fellow men to acknowledge that not only are the 4 indigenous mechanisms led by women, but also the Secretariat is led by women. So thank you for your leadership. In the interest of time, Madam Chair, I'd like to request all the 4 mechanisms, the Special Rapporteur, the Expert Mechanism, the Voluntary Fund, in recommending to the Permanent Forum 5 calls for action. 1, a high-level event in December to close the international year with a substantive outcome document which would leave a legacy for the year. Secondly, an international decade on indigenous languages with a focus on reclamation and revitalization. Third, UNESCO to develop an indigenous peoples platform within that agency to ensure indigenous peoples are active in all areas of this work throughout the UN. The Indigenous Peoples Platform at the FCCC can be a model for this. Fourthly, states to consider domestic legislation for the reclamation and revitalization of indigenous languages. Lastly, states to meet their duty of redress by providing adequate, sustained support to enable delivery of trauma-informed language.
I thank Chief Willie Littlechild of his statement on behalf of Canada. And next one on this list is Mauricio Yacuana of Mutucara Association, Yanomi, Brazil.
Muchísimas gracias, Presidenta. Eu estou muito feliz de estar aqui na conferência da ONU. Eu estou carregando em nome do povo Yanomami, a terra indígena Yanomami, que tem a maior terra indígena no Brasil. Estamos preocupados por ameaças muito grandes na declaração do senhor presidente do Brasil, Jair Bolsonaro. Gostaria de falar aqui em nome do povo indígena do Brasil. Gostaríamos que o governo brasileiro tenha respeito com os povos indígenas, porque são a maior dos defensores do bosque da Amazônia brasileira. Também que o governo brasileiro respeite os protocolos próprios construídos pelos próprios indígenas, para que tenhamos de algo bem tranquilidade em respeito dos povos indígenas. Então, a relatora da ONU, a Victoria, os que você pensa como podemos pedir ajuda para prevenir essas ameaças do senhor presidente Jair Bolsonaro, porque a terra indígena está pedindo ajuda muito grande ao mundo. E também gostaria de falar que todos os governos dos outros países do mundo inteiro que respeitem aos povos indígenas, porque com a resistência dos povos indígenas que o mundo está hoje vivendo. São os maiores defensores da terra de todos os países. Então, gostaríamos que o governo de todos os países tenha respeito aos povos indígenas. Muitíssimas graças, senhora presidenta.
I thank the representative of his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Mexico. You have the floor.
Estimada señora Victoria Tauli Korpus, relatora especial sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, hermanas y hermanos reunidos en esta sala, el Gobierno de México desea expresarle su reconocimiento y agradecimiento por su misión oficial a nuestro país en el año 2017 y sus recomendaciones formuladas, así como por su última visita en este año 2019 en ocasión del Seminario Internacional sobre Libre Determinación realizada en la Ciudad de México, en la cual tuvimos la oportunidad de establecer diálogos constructivos que nos han ayudado a impulsar las iniciativas para establecer una nueva relación del Estado mexicano con los pueblos indígenas. Para mi delegación es importante destacar que esta nueva relación comienza a ser una realidad en este gobierno que encabeza el presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador con la ley de creación del Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas, con la cual se atienden a varias de sus recomendaciones. Agradezco especialmente, señora relatora, las importantes opiniones que usted emitió al respecto y que han sido retomados en su cabalidad. También quiero mencionar en esta importante reunión el anuncio que ha hecho el presidente de México, anuncio que hizo el día 21 de diciembre del año 2018 con relación al Programa Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas 2018-2024, que establece la hoja de ruta, la hoja de atención que recibirán los pueblos indígenas de nuestro país en la administración del presidente, del licenciado Andrés Manuel López Obrador. También quiero destacar que este gobierno de la República, a través del Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas, ha elaborado un documento sobre el derecho a la consulta libre, previa e informada de los pueblos indígenas para su implementación en el marco de la Administración Pública Federal. De modo que es este documento, el documento rector que estará guiando la realización de las consultas indígenas de nuestro país. Y finalmente, para atender plenamente sus recomendaciones, me es grato informarle que en los próximos días habremos de iniciar el proceso de reforma constitucional y legal que reconozca plenamente los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y afromexicanos en nuestro país, a fin de armonizar nuestra legislación nacional con los avances internacionales en la materia. Esperamos, señora relatora, su decidida contribución a este respecto. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. And I remind the speakers that this is an interactive dialogue, and the aim of the dialogue is to provide questions and comments to the panelists, please. So next one on the speakers list is Roy C., New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to bring to Victoria's attention the Special Rapporteur, and thank you for your visit down to Australia. We really appreciated your visit, and also James and I. We're struggling with how we use this mechanism to be able to highlight and bring to attention the issues that are happening back home in Australia. We travel 17 hours to come here and speak for 3 minutes. And, you know, that's a big commitment. So, Victoria, we thank you as a Special Rapporteur to come to Australia. It's a long away, but we still have issues. We had fish kills in one of our communities in Menindee. We had over 1 million fish die because of the abuse of our river system. We looked after that river system for time immemorial, 60,000 years. It's fed our communities. It's fed our kids and our children. It got up to 51 degrees Celsius. 51 degrees Celsius in a community of Menindee. It was summer holidays. Our kids couldn't go outside because it was too hot. They couldn't go down the river because it was too contaminated to swim in. And the abuse of the river system, Victoria, is really, it's a shame and an indictment on a country like Australia. And the representatives that are here from Australia, I mean no disrespect to you that you come to this forum. However, it's frustrating when my elders have to use baby wipes and they're 85 years old to clean themselves because there's no fresh water. Water is a basic human right under the articles of the Declaration. So, Madam Chair, my point is this, Victoria, we need to continue to use this forum to be able to raise these issues and get people like you to come and visit our country, because it's getting hotter. We got up to 54 degrees Celsius. 54 degrees Celsius. So, and the fish that has sustained us for cultural flows in our river system and the abuse of our river system, we're calling on the Australian government to implement a royal commission so we can get to the bottom of how man-made is overruling spiritual law.
I thank the representative of New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. And next one on the speakers list is Denmark. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have the honor to make this intervention on behalf of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, together with Greenland. And worry not, there are actually questions in this intervention also. Now, it remains a long-standing priority of the Nordic countries to promote and protect the rights of indigenous people. Now, both the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples play, in our view, an important part in ensuring the realization of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, to ensure that rights on paper are turned into reality outside these chambers. However, as recent work of the Special Rapporteur, as well as the Human Rights Council's recent resolution on environmental human rights defenders illustrate, indigenous people's rights and indigenous human rights defenders continue to be under pressure. Therefore, it is in our view important as ever before to keep focus on this matter, and that is why we are pleased to participate in today's dialogue with both of you. You play a key role in ensuring that we, the member states of the United Nations, deliver what we pledge. Now, Ms. Korpus, in the fulfillment of your mandate as Special Rapporteur, you work with the promotion of good practices, such as government programs and cooperation between states and indigenous peoples. You've now held your mandate for more than 5 years and have been able to follow and monitor the agenda since the World Conference on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2014. We would like to take this opportunity to ask you, what are the main changes or developments that you have seen during this period, and where do you see the greatest need for further attention from the international community? Now, turning to the chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, we follow with interest the developments in the work of MRIP since the revision of its mandate in September 2016. The mandate was revised to ensure closer monitoring and focus efforts on implementation of the articles of UNPFII. We therefore particularly welcome the choice of topics for your thematic report of 2021, namely that of self-determination. Now, MRIP's first ever country engagement mission took place at the request of the Sami Parliament of Finland in Inari and Helsinki in February 2018. The advice and facilitation provided by MRIP was found very valuable. The Nordic countries look forward to continuing the dialogue with MRIP also in the future to further this kind of collaboration. Now, allow me to conclude by reminding all of us about the significance of the letter S. Now, the UN Charter's opening sentence is not "we the people," it is "we the peoples." Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark and the Nordic states of their joint statement. And next one on the speakers list is Petra Laiti and Susanna Israelsson, the Sami youth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The following questions are posed by every Sami youth organization represented at this session. The defining characteristic of being indigenous is the relationship and the inherence we share with our lands. Indigenous youth face a heavy task as our choices today have long-standing effects on future generations. As young leaders and protectors, we hold the obligation and responsibility to demand for intergenerational justice. We are looking for long-term solutions for our people in order to be able to continue to maintain our cultural traditions, livelihoods, language, everything.
Madam Chair, the Sami youth have long felt frustrated about the issues raised by the distinguished chair of MRIP. We have long felt that the prerequisites of negotiations with states are always poised against us and that FPIC is not understood on a legislative level. Development in the name of renewable energy is being pushed on Sami lands, limiting our capacity to practice our livelihoods and culture and thus exist. As the Arctic is rapidly changing due to climate change, our need for a solution grows. We would like to ask the chair of MRIP as to how this new mechanism that she spoke of could be used to secure and deliver justice to future generations. How can Indigenous youths be involved in the work of this new mechanism? And since the Sami are one people living across 4 states, how can the mechanism be used to seek cross-border solutions? Olu kiitos, thank you very much.
Kiitos.
I thank the representative of Sami youth for their questions. And next one is my colleague Tarsila Rivera-Zea. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, hermana presidenta. Y cabe reconocer los esfuerzos y aportes de cada una y cada uno de ustedes. Y quiero felicitar a la hermana Vicky Tauli, que durante su periodo ha hecho un trabajo muy comprometido y que ha podido visibilizarse todo lo relacionado a la violación de derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas. En ese sentido, yo quisiera hacer una pregunta directa a ella, porque nos preocupa mucho el gran aumento del feminicidio y muerte de mujeres en los diferentes países del mundo, y que lamentablemente cada muerte, cada mujer que aparece en los noticieros son mujeres que mueren en manos de otras personas, y ellas tienen un origen popular, vienen de un sector marginal o vienen de barrios marginales. Son muertas anónimas porque no se tiene la información acerca de su procedencia o su condición étnica cultural. En ese sentido, me gustaría saber si el esfuerzo que usted hace como relatora especial específicamente de pueblos y ha presentado reportes sobre mujeres indígenas, tiene un nivel de coordinación o de acciones complementarias con las otras relatorías relacionadas con los derechos de las mujeres en general, porque sería interesante escuchar sus comentarios, como por ejemplo, las mujeres indígenas estamos tratando de conocer el mecanismo de la CEDAW y nos gustaría saber si esta coordinación, relación y complementariedad de sus acciones puede llevarnos a visibilizar esta problemática que duele mucho, también relacionado con la niña y joven indígena que generalmente está en la trata, en espacios donde no se sabe de dónde vienen. Entonces es indispensable tener los datos desagregados. Sí me gustaría hacer una felicitación también al MRIP. Muchas gracias por darnos esas buenas lecciones. Y para la presidenta del Fondo de Contribuciones Voluntarias, se ha ampliado la responsabilidad del fondo porque está cubriendo varios escenarios y nos gustaría saber si está contenta o están contentos como fondo con el nivel de aportes que se logran, porque es el único fondo al que acceden líderes que no necesariamente están con fondos propios, así que sería interesante escuchar sus comentarios. Gracias, hermanas, por todos los aportes que nos hacen. Y hay que preguntar y comentar porque esta es la oportunidad. Gracias.
I thank my colleague Tarsila for her statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Guatemala. You have the floor.
Sakrik Konohel, señora presidenta, señora relatora, miembros del foro, Guatemala agradece la visita de su excelencia realizada del 1 al 10 de mayo del año 2018, ocasión en la que recibimos sus puntuales recomendaciones, mismas que nos sirven de referencia para mejorar las acciones institucionales en garantía de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Estamos claros que muchos de los temas indicados en su informe final requieren de cambios estructurales que deben convocar la atención de todos los sectores sociales del país. Actualmente, la Comisión Presidencial contra la Discriminación y el Racismo contra los Pueblos Indígenas en Guatemala, CODISRA, como ente asesor de la Mesa Técnica de Pueblos Indígenas del Gabinete Específico de Desarrollo Social, se está ocupando en revisar dichas recomendaciones y sean asumidas por las instituciones de acuerdo a sus competencias. Estamos proyectando para que en los próximos años seamos acompañados en la prestación de asesorías especializadas hacia las instituciones públicas y otros sectores de poder público. Señora relatora, Guatemala sigue firme en la atención de sus compromisos internacionales en materia de derechos humanos. Prueba de ello, este 25 y 26 de abril estará presentando sus informes periódicos 16 y 17 en cumplimiento de la Convención Internacional sobre la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación racial ante el Comité para la Eliminación de la Discriminación Racial de las Naciones Unidas. A su excelencia, le seguimos animando en su labor por los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Guatemala, and now I give the floor to my colleague Jens Dahl.
Put your hand up, Jens.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. This year is a year of indigenous languages, and we have had a lot of statements on the threat against indigenous languages, how many of them is in the Red Book of dying out, and we have the implication of indigenous peoples losing their language. Today we also, the Special Rapporteur, she mentioned another thing, another group of people, the people in voluntary isolation. And there was our friend, indigenous friend from Brazil, who in a more general terms expressed concern about the policy of the Brazilian president, not only for people in voluntary isolation, but in general to the indigenous peoples of Brazil and to the Amazon, and also in general. And now also our chair of MRIP is herself from Brazil. And I would like a question to you two specifically. I think this is we should be concerned about this, and we should know that in a very few years, this policy of the Brazilian president will have an enormous effect on not only people in voluntary isolation, but specifically people in voluntary isolation. It's a difficult issue, I know, but I would like to ask the two of you, is there anything that the free or even four mechanism can do in conjunction to do anything to prevent that further attack on people in voluntary isolation? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. And now I give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Malizer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was interested with the Special Rapporteur's presentation the comment that the visit to Timor-Leste was the first visit to an Asian region or country, and I just wonder if there's, and I hear a number of countries taking the floor, which is good, but we are familiar with these countries and the representations talking on these issues, so we'll welcome their questions. In our sessions, we do hear from the Asian region, from the Indigenous peoples, and in some cases the Asian countries, and even some concerns coming from the Asian countries about the work here. So I would just like your comment and feedback on that, because I think as a permanent forum we need to be able to engage more with countries in that region about rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mullerser for his comment. And now I give the floor to Fimi Chumilkai Kuruchiche Nicho. You have the floor. Fimi Chumilkai Kuruchiche Nicho. You have the floor.
Buenas tardes, señora presidenta. Las mujeres indígenas de las 5 regiones del mundo que integramos la 6ª edición de la Escuela Global de Liderazgos del Foro Internacional de Mujeres Indígenas, saludamos a los pueblos indígenas presentes en la 18ª sesión del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas de Naciones Unidas. Las mujeres indígenas enfrentamos el extractivismo, la presencia de los monocultivos, la criminalización, los asesinatos a defensoras, el desplazamiento y migración forzada, la inseguridad, los asesinatos, la discriminación y pobreza. Esto pone en riesgo nuestra vida, soberanía alimentaria y sostenibilidad cultural, política y económica. A casi 25 años de la conferencia de Beijing, la violencia, los femicidios en contra de las mujeres y niñas indígenas sigue siendo la amenaza más grande a nuestra sobrevivencia y continuidad. Los pueblos, las mujeres indígenas transmitimos nuestros idiomas y salvaguardamos los conocimientos. Por ello nos preocupa que nuestra cultura y conocimientos ancestrales estén siendo cosificadas y folclorizadas, víctimas del uso indebido y apropiación cultural, violentando así nuestros derechos, entre ellos la propiedad intelectual colectiva. Ante esto estamos en la defensa de nuestros territorios, de nuestras vestimentas, del cuidado de la madre tierra, semillas, medicinas, idiomas indígenas, culturas y cosmovisiones. Esto es parte de nuestra identidad individual y colectiva. En el marco de la Agenda 2030, exhortamos al Foro Permanente a considerar las siguientes recomendaciones: que los órganos de los estados legislen e implementen políticas públicas con la participación plena y efectiva de las mujeres y pueblos indígenas, para proteger elementos tangibles e intangibles de nuestras culturas y los derechos de los pueblos indígenas a la propiedad intelectual colectiva, retomando las recomendaciones del Foro Permanente 15.44 de la 15ª sesión y el 11.53 de la 11ª sesión. 2. Que la Asamblea General promueva mecanismos para garantizar el cumplimiento de las recomendaciones emanadas al Foro Permanente dirigidas a Estados miembros. 3. Que el Comité para la Eliminación de la Discriminación contra la Mujer, CEDAW, examine y genere recomendaciones sobre las problemáticas específicas de las mujeres indígenas para el año 2020, asegurando la participación plena y efectiva de las mujeres indígenas en dichos procesos, en concordancia con la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Por una vida mejor para nuestros pueblos.
I thank the representative of FIMI, and I will allow 3 more speakers, and then I'll have the possibility for our panelists to respond to the questions and comments. And the first one on my list is the representative of Chile. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Junto con agradecer el informe y las recomendaciones de la relatora, señalar que es un desafío en extremo relevante para el gobierno de Chile y de todos los chilenos respetar, proteger y promover el desarrollo de los 9 pueblos indígenas que habitan en el territorio nacional. Este reconocimiento se ve sustentado en la ley indígena vigente desde 1993, la ratificación por parte de Chile del Convenio 169 y la adopción de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. El 24 de septiembre de 2018, el presidente Sebastián Piñera presentó una propuesta de acuerdo nacional por el desarrollo y la paz en la Araucanía, un acuerdo integral e inclusivo construido sobre la voluntad de diálogo y reconocimiento del carácter intercultural de la Araucanía que permita a todos los habitantes vivir y desarrollarse en igualdad de condiciones sin que nadie se quede atrás. En su eje de reconocimiento y valoración de nuestra diversidad, el acuerdo contempla una serie de medidas administrativas y legislativas en favor de los pueblos indígenas. Una de ellas hace referencia a la necesidad de realizar mejoras en algunos aspectos de la ley indígena, por lo cual se hace necesario flexibilizar algunos puntos que no estarían permitiendo un adecuado desarrollo cultural, social y económico de los pueblos indígenas, siempre manteniendo como principio la protección de sus tierras, que es para ellos el fundamento principal de su existencia, cultura e identidad. Siendo esto una medida legislativa que afecta directamente a los pueblos y de acuerdo al convenio 169, se realizará un adecuado proceso de consulta previa. Adicionalmente, el programa Gobierno contempla avanzar en el reconocimiento constitucional de los pueblos indígenas y fortalecer la institucionalidad indígena de nuestro país, apoyando el proyecto de ley que crea el Ministerio de Pueblos Indígenas y el Consejo Nacional y Consejo de Pueblos. Quiero destacar además los esfuerzos del Gobierno en avanzar en el reconocimiento y revitalización de la cultura y lengua indígena. Un ejemplo de esto es el proceso consulta indígena realizado hace pocas semanas sobre las bases curriculares para la asignatura La Lengua y Cultura de los Pueblos Indígenas y la realización de cursos de e-learning de Mapudungún en los niveles básicos e intermedios para 20.000 personas en todo Chile. No obstante a esto, hubo otros ejemplos para un real avance en la revitalización de la cultura de las lenguas indígenas. Este esfuerzo no puede depender solo del Estado, sino también de la sociedad en su conjunto, donde la población indígena y no indígena de Chile trabajemos juntos por nuestro patrimonio cultural, del cual nos sintamos orgullosos y preservemos con una mirada y acciones comunes. En este sentido, señora relatora, me gustaría preguntarle qué recomendaciones daría usted a los Estados para apoyar la revitalización de las lenguas indígenas. Finalmente, reafirmar que para el gobierno del presidente Sebastián Piñera, las políticas públicas para los pueblos indígenas son una prioridad donde se busca propiciar las herramientas para el desarrollo cultural, social, económico, respetando la cosmovisión, culturas y tradiciones. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. Sorry, the representative of Chile for their statement. And now I give the floor to Tupac Enrique Acosta of Tonatierra.
Good afternoon. Special greetings to the Special Rapporteur and a word of appreciation for her visit to Mexico. At the moment, we would attempt to recall what Samir Flores might have to say to this body, to this assembly. And in a word of appreciation and also question, we would present to the entire assembly gathered here, the permanent foreign members and the indigenous nations constituencies, including the ancestry of the past and future generations. There's been much discussion on the issue of language and the application of language systems in terms of law and justice in this forum and in this session. There has been no conversation or discussion as far as how the concept or the articulation of mandate itself could be brought into question for the purposes of a dialogue, an intercultural dialogue, a conversation. And the clarification must be made, and then I will submit the question for the body. When the indigenous nations and peoples are being subjected to genocide and colonization, there is not an opportunity for a conversation. There's not an opportunity for a dialogue. There's not the proper venue for a forum. In particular, if it is not first recognized that just as the states may have their own particular and collective mandate within the UN system, we as original nations, we also have mandate, collective and planetary, as defenders of and advocates for the territorial integrity of Mother Earth. Based on that, we would submit these questions. Number one, United Nations Resolution 1514, its application in this continent. Why is that being blocked by the theory of the Salt Sea Doctrine and its failure to be applied in this continent? Why is it being blocked by the assertion by the government states of the Americas, which is not the name of this continent, that they are indigenous governments to this hemisphere? Number two, United Nations Resolution 1514. Where is that process being forward in terms of the United Nations Decolonization Committee? Where are the three deliberative bodies that have been mentioned in this session, where they have addressed the United Nations Decolonization Committee? And when will we may see the United Nations Decolonization Committee come to this body and make a presentation about the application of what the United Nations Permanent Forum itself called for, namely the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery in this continent and around the world. I leave you with that. Thank you so much.
I thank the representative of Donatierra for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Brazil. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would like to reiterate our constitutional and international commitments regarding the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Allow me also to remember that Brazil has recognized over 600 indigenous lands, which accounts for more than 12% of our territory, most of it in the Amazon region. Since the inauguration of the recently elected government, there were two major operations undertaken by the federal police to react to invasions of the Uru Euauau and the Igarapé-Laje indigenous lands. Recently, the National Indigenous Foundation incorporated 102 new civil servants in order to support its mandate and the promotion of the rights of the approximately 300 ethnic indigenous groups in Brazil. On the issues of the safety of human rights defenders, allow me also, representatives from the mechanism, to inform that the Brazilian government has been actively pursuing policies to address it. Since 2007, Brazil has a national policy of human rights defenders protection. Since 2016, the Program of Protection of Human Rights also came into place. Protective measures by the Brazilian federal government include workplace visits to human rights defenders, town hall meetings aimed at conflict solution, coordination with local authorities to quickly react to threats against indigenous peoples, monitoring of investigations, and, as a last resort, supporting the reallocation of threatened indigenous peoples. Besides count with specific federal programs, the witness protection programs offer additional support, reaching more than 500 people, many of whom indigenous peoples. Regarding voluntary isolation, the National Indigenous Foundation, FUNAI, has continued to perform policies of protection. There are 28 confirmed indigenous peoples living in isolation in Brazil. There are 11 specialized units of FUNAI dedicated to a very successful program of protection of isolated indigenous peoples. In 2017, there was a unit of FUNAI established in the Javari Basin region. This year, 2 additional bases will be established in the Yanomami land. Brazil has always acknowledged and supported the mandates of international indigenous peoples mechanisms and commitments, including the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people and the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people. That does not mean, on the other hand, that we will always agree. We continue to be open to dialogue, though. Brazil continues to seek policies that are consistent to its national and international commitments. To name one example, Brazil has actually increased the federal budget dedicated to human rights defenders protection. Last year, the budget of the aforementioned programs were increased by 34%. As much as we recognize challenges mentioned by some in this debate, there should be due regard to objective data, efforts being undertaken on the ground, and the continue of a constructive dialogue with all stakeholders, including the recent.
I thank the representative of Brazil. And now I give the floor to Hawe Buba Moskuda from Indigenous Peoples Organization from Cameroon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Madam Chair, the African continent is one of those regions where the concept of indigenous people is still difficult to accept. It would have been ideal that the special mechanisms should have put more emphasis on this continent during their mandates. In these past 3 years, pastoralists in Central, West and Eastern Africa suffered from grave human rights violations in the form of massive killings in Nigeria, in Cameroon, Mali, Ghana, Tanzania, to name these just a few countries. The most recent was the massacres in Mali of more than 100 people in just one day. And these killings attracted international attention, while the other killings were never talked about. In Nigeria, we had more than 1,000 people killed from 2017 to 2018. In Cameroon, more than 140 pastoralists have been killed in the crisis opposing the government of Cameroon and the separatist groups in the northwest and southwest of Cameroon. In Ghana, it is still the same story. My question is going to be addressed to the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, Madam Victoria. From her report, which we listened to, we've noticed that she put a lot of effort, working towards South America and maybe East and maybe Asia. And she herself, I think she acknowledged that she did little maybe in Africa. I remember having Madame in Cameroon in 2015, December, where we had the African Commission on Human and People's Rights organizing the conference on the outcome document. And we discussed about her visit to Cameroon. And my organization was ready to facilitate her visit to Cameroon. But till today, we never received any demand or asking our organization to help facilitate this visit. And I would just want to find out what were the kind of difficulties that the Special Rapporteur really encountered, that she was not able to, put some more emphasis in Africa to help this continent also push the issues of indigenous people at the forefront. Thank you, Madam.
I thank the representative from Cameroon. And now I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Considerando que esta es la primera ocasión que intervengo, me gustaría felicitarla por su elección como presidenta del Foro Permanente de Cuestiones Indígenas. Mi delegación agradece al Foro Permanente por la organización de este diálogo con la relatora especial sobre la situación de los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas. Doy la bienvenida a la señora Victoria Tauli Korpus y le agradezco por su presentación. Las políticas gubernamentales de mi país se enmarcan en una propuesta de apertura al diálogo con todos los sectores sociales con el propósito de escuchar todas las voces y de poder plasmar en las políticas públicas la promoción de los derechos de los diferentes colectivos. En esta línea, se ha renovado el diálogo con los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas para consolidar nuestra participación activa en las decisiones estatales y el cumplimiento de los derechos estipulados en la Constitución y en los instrumentos internacionales. En septiembre de 2018, el Ecuador se convirtió en el quinto país del mundo en ratificar las 18 convenciones básicas para la protección de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, en una clara muestra de su pleno compromiso con los derechos humanos. Aunque hay retos pendientes, el Gobierno nacional ha emprendido en tareas para hallar soluciones. La invitación a los titulares de mandato de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas son una clara muestra de esa voluntad de avanzar. Apreciamos la visita realizada por la señora Victoria Tauli Korpus a mi país el año pasado, del 19 al 29 de noviembre de 2018, lo que significó una oportunidad de profundizar el diálogo e intercambio con los sectores nacionales e internacionales involucrados en la protección de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Nos complace resaltar que la relatora especial fue recibida por el presidente de la República, Lenín Moreno, el canciller José Valencia, la presidenta de la Asamblea Nacional y otras altas autoridades de las instituciones del Estado. Además, se realizaron mesas interinstitucionales en torno a temas sociales, ambientales y económicos, así como encuentros con los líderes de los movimientos indígenas y varias comunidades. Esperamos con interés el informe sobre esta visita, que coincidió con la conmemoración de los 10 años de la adopción de la Constitución de 2008, que estipula que el Ecuador es un país intercultural y plurinacional y que reconoce derechos colectivos de los pueblos indígenas. Confiamos en que las recomendaciones que se desprendan de este documento permitan al Estado seguir adelante y mejorar la protección de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. And now I give the floor to the last speaker of the interactive dialogue, Mr. Valentin Andreitsev, Ripon. You have the floor.
Уважаемый председатель, уважаемые участники постоянного форума, я представитель народа УДГ из России, Приморского края. Возглавляю Союз коренных народов своего региона. Всего в мире удыгейцев осталось не более 1500 человек. Нас беспокоит тема охраны природы и прав коренных народов. К сожалению, это характерно для всего мира, когда программы направлены вроде бы на благое дело, охраны природы могут негативно влиять на положение коренных народов. В Приморском крае созданы 6 особо охраняемых природных территорий федерального и регионального значения. В стране существуют законы на федеральном и региональном уровне, которые предусматривают наше право на ведение традиционной хозяйственной деятельности в границах национальных парков. Лишь в одном из них прописаны права коренных народов. На деле мы нередко сталкиваемся с рядом сложностей. Например, взимается плата за вход на территорию парков, существуют ограничения на ведение традиционной хозяйственной деятельности, охоту, сбор дикоросов, рыболовство. Ситуация осложняется и тем, что реализация проектов по созданию этих особо охраняемых природных территорий инициирована такой международной организацией, как Всемирный фонд дикой природы. Мы инициаторам задаем вопрос, что главнее, сохранение природы, биоразнообразия или сохранение традиционного образа жизни и традиционных видов хозяйствования. Наши традиционные знания способствовали сохранению флоры и фауны, имеют важное значение для поддержания биологического разнообразия, неистощительного использования ресурсов и обеспечения устойчивого развития на территориях. Защищая природу, мы требуем, чтобы права коренных жителей были защищены. Международные организации своей деятельности должны согласовывать свою политику с существующими стандартами международного права в сфере, ориентироваться на Декларацию Организации Объединенных Наций о правах коренных народов. Мы считаем, что должен быть построен конструктивный диалог между нами, коренными жителями и представителями международных организаций, которые, прежде чем начинать реализовывать свои проекты на наших землях, в первую очередь должны выслушать нас и учитывать наши интересы. Мы должны быть услышаны на этапе разработок проектов на основе принципов объективности и добровольности. Государствам необходимо совершенствовать законодательство в части создания особо охраняемых природных территорий с учетом мнений коренных народов. Сохраним права коренных народов, сохраним нашу природу и землю вместе. Спасибо.
I thank the representative of Ripon for his statement, and I give now the floor to my colleague, Pullman Chaudhary.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to remind last year 2018 session's recommendation made by Permanent Forum. The recommendation number is 95. The Permanent Forum expressed appreciation for Nepal being the only Asian country to ratify the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 169 in 2007. Nevertheless, it is concerning that even 10 years after ratification, the government has not adopted a national action plan to implement the convention. The forum recommends that Nepal immediately adopt a national action plan, including in line with its commitment in the outcome document of All Conference on Indigenous People. The forum urged the Asian state to consider ratifying the convention as per the recommendation made by treaty bodies and in the Universal Periodic Review. So this is the recommendation, particularly for the Nepal government. But still, Nepal government has not a concrete action plan to respect the ILO Convention 169. So how we can make more responsible to the Nepal government to respect this ILO Convention 169? So this question goes to the Special Rapporteur, Victoria Tauli Korpus. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shodbury. And now I give the floor to our distinguished guests, panelists, and I will start from Ms. Erika Yamada. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, starting with New Zealand, Mexico, and Finland, just to reiterate how the openness and willingness of the countries, as well of indigenous people, to work with MRIP express the real trust in the mechanism, but also the trust in their own commitments towards the Declaration and human rights treaties for indigenous peoples. So we are happy to have here in the dialogue the mentions of the experiences that we had. And New Zealand, Mexico, and Finland, you've been the leading countries to, together with MRIP, implement our new mandate. And I hope other countries will be inspired by the experiences that we developed in those countries to ask for further support. Particularly the Nordic countries, I have to acknowledge the full support you've been giving to the mechanism for our new mandate. And the so many times that we've worked together to advance the interests of indigenous people within the Human Rights Council. And I should mention that for the first time after several years trying to having a special panel in the Human Rights Council to address the situation of indigenous people's human rights defenders, we finally got it. Not for this year, but for next year. So I really think all of us, including the Forum Voluntary Fund, we should work in the preparation for that panel as well, as it is such an important and urgent topic for indigenous people. I also take the opportunity to mention that there is still space, even for the Nordic countries, even though we work so closely, there is still space for further collaboration. For example, we have a request pertaining to Sweden, a request from indigenous peoples for repatriation of sacred objects and remains that are in a museum in Sweden. And it is really an opportunity for Sweden to be a leading case of dialogue with indigenous people for this kind of repatriation, this kind of redress for indigenous people. To the youth, I would say that one of the aspects of our new mandate is that MRIP is being called to facilitate dialogue. And I would say that youth are the real experts on dialogues, right? So I would continue to invite you to be engaging with MRIP, particularly regarding cross-border solutions. I would encourage you to submit still inputs to our study on migration, borders, and displacement. This year, we made all the efforts so that our study will be up for consultation way before the session, so that you all have time and you have the translated versions of the draft study before our July session. I would also like to mention that we also at the mechanism are always trying to improve how we balance our regional activities and engagements. And this year, we will have our expert seminar in South Africa, together with the University of Pretoria, and the topic will be on land rights. That will be our special theme. Regarding indigenous identity, this is one of the aspects we are highlighting in our recognition, reparation, and reconciliation. We are developing in that study arguments on how the recognition of indigenous identity is the first and crucial step for all kinds of recognition, reparation, and reconciliation. And finally, regarding Brazil, maybe I should speak here not as chair of MRIP, but as an expert that comes from Brazil, and I could not let it aside and not to mention it because it does concerns me a lot. And I think for all of the mechanisms, the way we could have to support indigenous peoples, but not only indigenous people, the Brazilian society as a whole, and even some parts of the governments, is to help the state to look at the future. Not just what the state have done so far, especially when we have a current president that often make discourses expressing discrimination, hate, and intent for coming back to assimilationist policies towards indigenous people. I think we need to help to avoid regression. And how can the UN mechanisms do that? We can show that the existing policies and legislations in Brazil follows international human rights standards and therefore cannot be diminished, there cannot be regression in terms of what has been done so far. For example, towards indigenous people in volunteer isolation. The non-forced contact is established state policy that exists since 1987, and that should not be debatable if that is going to change for worse, because human rights can never be diminished, or at least can never be diminished without very serious consequence in the human rights system. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Yamada for her concluding remarks, and now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Claire Charters, the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much for your contributions and the few questions and comments directed to the Voluntary Fund. So one of the questions from Tarsila, the Permanent Forum member, involved whether we were satisfied with the level of contributions. As mentioned last year, 2018, we received the largest amount of contributions from states, the largest than the Voluntary Fund has ever received, which of course was incredibly gratifying and enables us to do our work. The concern, and there are a few states particularly who made incredibly generous contributions, although we are obviously very happy with any contribution at all. And on that note, one thing that has always concerned the trustees on the Voluntary Fund is that the contributions come from a very few number of states. So that means that if we lose funding from one particular state, particularly a big donor, it puts us in a very precarious position. So we would very much encourage states to make any contribution, even if it's a small one, so that we can diversify our contribution base and be more secure as a fund. And I would say, with respect to the level of funding, we also have this issue that we've always got increasing demands on the fund as well. So, as mentioned, we had 700 applications for the Permanent Forum and Expert Mechanism loan, and we funded roughly 100. That's not great odds. There are a lot of Indigenous voices and a lot of Indigenous people's representatives who are not here because we didn't have funding. So that's 1 in 7 receives funding who applies to these particular 2 bodies. So that's not great odds. So it highlights the need for increased and ongoing funding. There was another question about that related to concrete and practical ways in which all of the mechanism can support human rights defenders, particularly obviously Indigenous human rights defenders. And one very concrete way is to support the fund, actually. Because we see a number of Indigenous human rights defenders here in this forum and also in the expert mechanism. And I guess one of the beauties of the international system is that it enables some peoples to bring issues that are sometimes not heard at the domestic level because of domestic politics to be heard, and for attention to those issues to be brought from the international system as a whole, including from other Indigenous peoples. So that is one way in which I think one can provide practical support for human rights defenders is through contributions to the fund. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to talking to you bilaterally and multilaterally in the coming days also.
I thank Ms. Claire Charders for her concluding remarks, and now I give the floor to Special Rapporteur, Ms. Vicky Tauli Korpus. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Indeed, I do have a lot of questions. But first, I would like to start with the comment of Emboscuda. You know, I'm sure a lot of you are new. In the mandate of the special rapporteurs, we can only visit a country upon the invitation of the government. We can still go if we like to, but we cannot come up with any report. You know, if the government hasn't invited us, that's the only way that we are able to do the 10 days visit, and then we will make a full country report as a result of that visit. So I did reach out to Cameroon, to DRC, to Burundi. I reached out to most African countries. I never received an invitation. No, so that's not something that you should blame me for, because as long as the governments don't invite me, in the protocol of the UN, I cannot go there officially. And I think that the role of indigenous organizations like yours is to push your government to send an invitation for me. I told that already to many of your representatives. You have to be the ones who should push it from within, because what I always write them to ask for invitations, but I met with them several times. Even with Cameroon, I think I met 3 times with the ambassador in Geneva. And they said they will come back, but they never sent the official invitation. So that's the dilemma of the mandate. Unless we get those invitations, we can never just go to a country and do a mission. So, and I'd like everybody to know that, because that's the protocol that the UN has set for the special procedures. Secondly, I would like to I'd like to thank all the governments who have expressed their appreciation for the visit and the usefulness of the reports, Mexico, Ecuador, as well as Guatemala, no? Because I think that it's so important for me, for the mandate. What is important is that the governments whom I visited, the states whom I visited, will really look at the recommendations as something that we can all work together to have this implemented. And I remember in Brazil, when I did my visit, the prosecutor's office, they helped organize a meeting between the different agencies of the government as well as indigenous peoples to talk about the recommendations that I made and how these recommendations can be implemented. How far this has gone, I still have to look into that myself. But that was one of the highlights of the visit in Brazil, because the government went out of its way to really put together the various government bodies to talk about how each of these bodies can implement the recommendations. The other thing in Mexico, for instance, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights got all the recommendations that I made. They even translated it into the local languages, and they distributed it widely. So this remains as a piece of dialogue, as an instrument for continuous dialogue between the indigenous peoples and the government. No? So those are some of the good practices that I think have have been done, this is in response to Denmark's question, what are the good practices that I have seen? I think the good practices is really the willingness, for me, the willingness and openness of governments to invite me. Sometimes they feel like, why should we invite you when we invite you, you just criticize us and we are subjected to all these criticisms. Whereas the worst countries, they never invite you, and so there are no criticisms against them. But that's the situation. And in fact, that's why I'm so happy that governments invite me, because of course at the end of the mission, I will have to say what I have seen in all the visits that I have, as well as the discussions that I have with government. And so another good practice, of course, is the capacity of the government to really help organize meetings between me and the high-level officials. This is very crucial because at least you have a feeling that they are taking into a serious account whatever and they want to engage in a dialogue, and in the next processes, then I can remind them about the discussions that we have and the basis of the recommendations that I made. The third good practice that I've seen is more from indigenous people's efforts. The indigenous peoples are the ones who have persistently pressured also governments to invite me. And what I have seen in terms of what has been implemented is really with the assertion of indigenous peoples of their rights. They managed to get some gains, sometimes even without the support of the government, but in other cases, they do get the support of the government eventually. And I'm saying this because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas that I work in is in indigenous governance. And the seminar that we had in Mexico recently, which was hosted by the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples in Mexico, Adelfo Regino, who spoke earlier, I received a lot of reports from many of the participants, because this was a global meeting, about how they have really decided that they will create their own autonomous governments. And now they are showing that the results of having such autonomous governments are much better in terms of peace and security, in terms of well-being of indigenous peoples, in terms of them being able to practice their traditional knowledge systems and defend their own territories and lands. And one of the things that have been said repeatedly in the meeting was they also have the possibility to elect their own officials. In many cases, it was mentioned in Mexico, they even prevented political parties from coming into their communities because they feel that political parties just go and divide them. So they should have the possibility to be able to choose their own representatives who don't represent any of those political parties. So I think that's precisely why I'm going to make a report on this that will be submitted to the General Assembly, because I see this as the source of hope for many indigenous peoples, that they are able to do that, to really strengthen their own indigenous governance systems, to give more possibilities for their authorities to be the ones to help govern their own communities, because the experience that they have in the past in terms of governance, mainly by the dominant populations, hasn't resulted into good results. So I think that's really a good piece of source of hope, for at least for me as a rapporteur, because that's really what inspired me a lot, that indeed there are many efforts. We don't know much about this, but the report that I will be making will make this more visible. And I think that such efforts should really be appreciated. We have people who came from Greenland as well as from Nunavut. Of course, they talked about some of the progresses that they have achieved, but also the challenges that they face in their in ruling themselves. So those are the good practices that I have seen, and I think that the challenge is how do governments support those kinds of efforts. In Mexico, many of the people who set up their own autonomous municipalities or areas said that in a lot of cases they were charges were filed against them that these were unconstitutional, no? But actually, the Constitution of Mexico does recognize indigenous governance. So in the end, all of those charges, they won. The indigenous peoples won in the Supreme Courts. And in the process, the government is sort of coming into terms with it and doing what it can to at least support these self-governing communities of indigenous peoples. No? So that's in relation to the good practice. Now, the point about the question raised by Jens and also by our indigenous representative from Brazil. Of course, Erica spoke on this, but I just wanted to say that it's really a serious concern, the situation of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. The reports that I have received would say that one of the actors that are really also playing a key role are the evangelical churches. No? And this is something that I have seen not just in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America. Usually the ones who have the capacity or maybe the tenacity to go into the indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation are some of these evangelical religions who are really who want to convert into Christianity, these people whom they maybe think as pagans or infidels, so they have to be converted. So that's one issue. The other issue, of course, is the increasing expansion of agribusinesses, no? And this is another issue that has to be dealt with. Yesterday, there was a panel here where Sonia Guadalajara spoke, and they spoke about the efforts of indigenous peoples to mobilize themselves to protest against some of these developments that are happening in Brazil. In fact, she had to leave because I think today they will have a massive national mass action that will address these issues that we are talking about here. So hopefully that will result into something that will change the situation there. Now the issue that Tarsila raised on how we are coordinating on the issue of femicide and, of course, domestic violence against women. As you know, there's a special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences. And she and I had been working together to look at the issue of femicides. And there's also a working group on the discrimination against women in law and practice. No? There are 5 people. So we do have meetings together because every June, all the rapporteurs, 57 of us meet, and we try to discuss how do we coordinate in the work that we are doing. So we do coordinate together. It's not at the maximum level, but still there's a coordination in that sense. We also coordinate with the treaty bodies. No, CEDAW has decided that they will make a general comment on indigenous women. We're still trying to work with them how this is going to come up. We are very concerned that if we are not going to be involved and indigenous women are not going to be involved, then it might come up with a general comment that doesn't necessarily reflect the way indigenous women would like to have those kinds of legal opinions. No? So I hope we can continue to work together on that. And then, and finally, the point that was raised by our colleague from Australia, about the fish kills and the increase in temperature. And that's the problem that, of course, the fish kill is really related very much to the pollution of your rivers. And I think that you really need to challenge the government to help address this issue. But the issue of increasing temperature is indeed, it's a global problem that we all face. And I think what we all need to do is to tell all those states who are really just continuing to ignore the recommendations of the Climate Change Convention, the Paris Agreement, to really change gear. Because as you may know, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has come up with the report, and they said we are just given like 11 years to half the emissions by 2030. The emissions should be go down to 50% and then eventually to stop all these emissions. Because unless we do that, we are really going to see even much worse situations, increases in temperature, climate variability, all the weather problems that we are facing. And that responsibility lies on all our shoulders. But of course, it lies very much on the shoulders of states, who are the ones who can really do something about this problem. No? The indigenous peoples, as I always say, we never created this problem. We are the ones facing the most adverse impacts because many of us live in very fragile environments and ecosystems. No? And we should be able to be given the support that we need to address this issue, especially in terms of adapting to the impacts of climate change. No? So I think that's an issue, again, that needs to be always revisited. And the Sustainable Development Goals have a goal specifically on that. So we'll have to see what the governments are saying in terms of meeting that particular goal. I think that's basically, those are the questions. Oh, there was a question from Russia about what is from the Raipon, no? What is more important, protecting nature or our ways of life? I think it's not just having that choice. No, we have to, of course, protect nature, but for us to be able to protect nature, we have to ensure that the human rights approach in conserving and protecting nature is going to be used. No, and I have said this. I made a report on conservation and the impacts on indigenous peoples. I was very critical about many of the protected areas that have been declared without even ensuring the participation of indigenous peoples. They have been evicted from the parks. That continues to happen even in Africa, as well as even in Asia, and I don't know in Latin America, but in Asia that's happening as well. So I think that we need to really push, again, the human rights framework to the conservationists and to the states who are working with them, because if the rights of indigenous peoples who have shown that they are the ones who have protected the remaining ecosystems that are still in a much better state, if their rights are not going to be respected, then the hope of saving these remaining ecosystems is really going to be very, very dim. No, and so again, to say that that is an important issue, the Permanent Forum has taken this up. They held an expert group meeting on this particular issue. So the three mechanisms should really work together to monitor the situation, but also to develop the kinds of proposals that should be promoted, and the implementation of the human rights approach to conservation and protection. So I think those are the questions that I have. Again, to thank all the governments of Cambodia. I thank, of course, the Nordic countries, for all the support that you have provided to the mandate as well as to the MRIP. And I hope that this kind of dialogue continues to be perpetuated in the Permanent Forum, which is really the body where we should have this kind of dialogue. Thank you very much to everybody, and thank you very much, Madam Chair, for all the support that you have provided to us.
I thank the Special Rapporteur, Vicky Tauli Korpus, for her concluding remarks. And I'd like to extend our thanks on behalf of the Permanent Forum for all the really good work you have been doing during these past years. And I wish all the best for the remaining of your mandate. And I'm sure our cooperation continues even though after your mandate. Thank you. And now I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers for joining us this morning and for their informative and thought-provoking presentations. I would also like to thank all the participants who intervened from the floor of your active participation. Distinguished delegates, we will now begin listening to the speakers inscribed on the list of under Agenda Item 9. Before giving the floor to the first speaker, I would kindly remind speakers of the following. Kindly raise your hands at the beginning of your statements in order to allow the sound engineer to identify you and activate your microphone. Please observe the time limit of 3 minutes. The light on the speaker's microphone will begin to flash at 2 minutes. This should be a signal to speakers to conclude their remarks. Speakers' microphones will be automatically cut off after 3 minutes. Please deliver your statements at a reasonable speed so that the interpreters can keep up. And now I give the floor to the first speaker, the representative of Botswana, His Excellency Frans van der Westhuizen, Minister of Local Government and Rural Development. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The government of Botswana welcomed the recent visit of the Special Rapporteur on minority issues, Dr. Fernand de Varenes, who was in Botswana from the 12th to the 24th August 2018 at the invitation of the government. While in Botswana, the Special Rapporteur had an opportunity to consult with minority and marginalized communities and a wide spectrum of civil society organizations. Botswana continues to make significant progress in addressing the needs and concerns of marginalized communities, including issues relating to respect for cultural diversity, development programs, social services, land distribution, as well as participation and consultation. As a result of our national policies and programs, we have also seen great improvements in the areas of economic empowerment, access to decent shelter, employment, and access to tertiary education, to cite a few. The promotion and protection of human rights remains a top priority for the government of Botswana. We also attach great importance to the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other regional and international human rights instruments. The Constitution of Botswana guarantees fundamental freedoms and basic human rights. The government of Botswana will continue to engage with all stakeholders, including marginalized communities and their representatives, to ensure that they are represented in all decision-making structures. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Botswana for his statement. And now I give the floor to the European Union.
What?
Madam Chair, I was confused because it sounded as if you were going back to agenda item 9. The EU attaches great importance to the fact that this dialogue brings all UN indigenous mechanisms together, allowing for dynamic discussions and exchange of information, lessons learned, and best practices. But it also allows for effective linkages and coherence between discussions taking place in the Human Rights Council, the Third Committee, and we would like to thank you all for the work that you do so diligently in carrying out your important mandates. At the Third Committee of the 73rd session of the General Assembly last autumn, the dialogue with you, Ms. Victoria Tauli Korpus, focused, like today, on your recent report drawing an alarming picture of the growing number of attacks against and criminalization of indigenous peoples defending their rights, including in the context of land, natural resources, and environment. The EU Council conclusions on indigenous peoples from 2017 confirms the EU's commitment to UNDRIP, and they underline the importance of giving priority to fighting the discrimination and inequalities, and also actions to address the threats to and violence against indigenous peoples and individuals, as well as to human rights defenders in the context of land and natural resources, in the protection of the environment, biodiversity, and climate. The EU has further stepped up in this regard its support to indigenous peoples and human rights defenders, working specifically on land issues, environment, biodiversity, and climate under the European Instrument for Human Rights and Democracy. Last year alone, we granted €5 million to human rights defenders and organizations who work on those issues. Of other recent development, we also supported the recent Council resolution of the Human Rights Council on recognizing the contribution of environmental human rights defenders to the enjoyment of human rights. And in this regard, I would like to pose this question, is how do you assess the potential impact of this resolution when implemented properly and respected in putting a stop to human rights abuses and violations against indigenous peoples in the context of environment and conservation efforts? Thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union for her statement, and I give now the floor to the representative of IPAC, Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, Mr. Moussa Haboune. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Moussa Haboune, je suis représentant de l'IPAC, la région d'Afrique. Nkidiouba, Moussa Haboune, Iwis Noura ou Nomazir, Imzar Nimzoura, Ifriqiya. La question des droits de l'homme est dans la totalité des continents africains clairement en retard. La situation des droits de l'homme et l'application des conventions internationales concernant cette matière ne sont pas toujours considérées ni appliquées. L'Afrique a connu à travers l'histoire des invasions, l'esclavage, la colonisation, les guerres. Et puis aujourd'hui, la plupart des pays africains ne respectent pas les droits du peuple autochtone. Nous pensons à tous les peuples qui ont souffert à travers le temps et qui ont subi les génocides commis contre eux, l'esclavage et le racisme. Je pense au peuple héros et Nama en Namibie. Je pense à l'acte de barbarie des Allemands au début du siècle dernier. Je pense au peuple Tutsi à la fin du siècle dernier et l'application de l'Europe dans le génocide du peuple Tutsi. Je pense au peuple du Nuba, de l'Égypte et du Soudan et le génocide commis par ces deux pays contre ce peuple autochtone. Je pense aussi au peuple amazigh de l'Afrique du Nord qui vit actuellement sous des dictatures et des régimes totalitaires qui ne considèrent pas son identité, ni sa langue, ni sa civilisation, ni sa culture. Enfin, je termine mon discours en vous faisant parvenir du cri du peuple amazigh, le peuple autochtone de l'Afrique du Nord, le peuple le plus ancestral de la Terre, qui est aujourd'hui victime du racisme constitutionnel, parfois, comme dans le cas du Maroc. À titre d'exemple, le peuple amazigh se confronte aujourd'hui à des problèmes sérieux, tels le racisme, marginalisation, génocide, spoliation de ses terres ou bien spoliation de ses terres. Nous sommes dans un problème de survie aujourd'hui. La question est devenue très sérieuse. La question s'appelle, ou bien s'intitule « Être ou ne pas être » pour nous. Et la situation connue est aujourd'hui dans un stade de gravité. C'est-à-dire, je vous invite tous, c'est-à-dire les dirigeants, tous les peuples autochtones, de considérer notre cri et le prendre en considération. Nous revendiquons d'inciter les pays africains à l'application et la déclaration des droits de l'homme selon les droits internationaux.
I thank the representative of IPAC, and now I give possibility for the Special Rapporteur to answer the question from the European Union. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yes, regarding that resolution that was passed in relation to environmental human rights defenders, I think that's a very important resolution, precisely because, and for indigenous peoples, this is key, because many of the struggles of indigenous peoples is to protect their lands, territories, and resources, and this is the environment that we are talking about. No? So I think that the implementation of this resolution is something that will be that should be monitored forward, and we should encourage governments to also adopt national laws to implement the resolution. I mean, this has happened also with the Human Rights Defenders Declaration, and there is now a push to have the governments make a law that will protect human rights defenders and establish mechanisms for that kind of protection. So I think it will run along the same line, and I hope that indigenous peoples will be able to be involved in ensuring that this resolution will be passed. And again, to thank you all for all the efforts in passing this resolution. I know it wasn't that easy, but the fact that that resolution is there is something that indigenous people should know more about, and they will be able to use it much more. And I think what needs to be done is a popularization of this resolution, and also exploring all the possibilities in terms of how this can be translated into national law and mechanisms. So thank you again for the EU, the Norwegian, the Nordic countries for putting forward this resolution and getting it finally adopted. Thank you.
Thank you. It is now 1:02. Therefore, I intend to adjourn this meeting. This afternoon at 3 o'clock, the Forum will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 11 and listen to a presentation by the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. This will be followed by the continuation of general discussion under Agenda Item 11. The meeting is adjourned.